In the mid-1960s, the United States was flying the most advanced fighter jet in the world over North Vietnam, and losing. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II was faster than anything the North Vietnamese could put in the air, better equipped, more powerful, and flown by pilots who had spent years training for exactly this kind of war. The engineers and strategists who had conceived it in the late 1950s had made a calculated decision. The era of the dogfight was over. But Vietnam would expose that assumption as categorically wrong. The Soviet Union had spent the 1950s developing a very different philosophy of fighter design, one that prioritized agility, simplicity, and the ability to turn inside a heavier opponent at low altitude. The result was two aircraft that, in the skies over North Vietnam, proved devastatingly effective against the Phantom. The MiG-17 was older, subsonic, and by Western standards, almost primitive. But in a low-altitude turning fight, it could outmaneuver the F-4 with ease, bleeding its opponent's speed and closing to gun range before the American pilot could disengage. The MiG-21 was a different kind of threat entirely, a Mach 2 interceptor, small enough to nearly disappear against the sky, used in fast, slashing attacks from the rear that were over before the target knew they had begun. The Pentagon needed answers. The problem was that nobody at any level of the U.S. military had ever actually flown a MiG. Nobody knew precisely what these aircraft could do, what their limits were, or how to counter them. Thanks to an unlikely sequence of events, that was about to change. The Americans weren't the only ones who needed to get their hands on a MiG. Half a world away, Israel had been wrestling with the same aircraft for several years. By 1966, Israel's main rivals, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, were operating a combined fleet of over 60 MiG-21s, and it seemed certain that another war in the region was only a matter of time. The Israeli Air Force had nothing in its inventory that could match the aircraft on paper, and almost no reliable intelligence on what it could actually do in combat. What they needed, more than anything else, was the real thing. The Mossad had been working toward exactly that since 1963. Previous attempts had ended badly. But in 1964, a tip from an unexpected source changed everything. An Iraqi Jew named Joseph, who had spent his life as a trusted figure in a prominent Maronite Christian household in Baghdad, quickly contacted Israeli officials in Tehran. He believed he knew someone who might be persuaded to help. That someone was Captain Munir Redfa, an Assyrian Christian pilot in the Iraqi Air Force, flying MiG-21s out of a base far from his family in Baghdad. Redfa was talented enough to have risen to deputy commander of his squadron, and frustrated enough to be looking for a way out. His Christian faith had blocked his promotion at every level. He'd been restricted to flying with smaller than standard fuel tanks because his commanders didn't trust him. The Mossad sent in an agent to make contact. Redfa's price was straightforward: $1 million, Israeli citizenship, and the guarantee that every member of his extended family would be safely extracted from Iraq before he flew. On August 16, 1966, Redfa climbed into his MiG-21, asked the ground crew to fill his tanks, and took off on what his base commander believed was a routine training flight. When Iraqi radar tracked him turning west toward the Jordanian border, controllers frantically radioed him to turn back. He switched off his radio. 2 Israeli Mirage 3s met him at the border and escorted him to Hatzor Air Base. He touched down, by his own account, on the last drop of fuel. The aircraft was painted in Israeli colors and given the serial number 007, likely a humorous reference to the cinematic way in which it had arrived. Then it was put to work. Within weeks, Israeli test pilot Danny Shapira was pushing it to its limits. Less than a year later, in a single engagement over the Golan Heights, Israeli pilots used what they had learned to shoot down 6 Syrian MiG-21s without losing a single aircraft of their own. Israel had pulled off one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the Cold War, and the results had been immediate and dramatic. In Washington, the implications were not lost on anyone. Military planners and intelligence officials who'd been watching the defection story unfold in the newspapers understood exactly what was sitting in that Israeli hangar. The most advanced Soviet fighter in the world, intact and flyable, in the hands of a friendly nation. But even so, getting access to it would be another matter. Moscow was already furious, and the Israelis were all too aware that sharing information about the MiG with the Americans would only provoke the Soviets further, something they were keen to avoid. If Washington were to convince them, it would take something special. Fortunately, it had just the ticket. For years, the Israelis had been asking for their own F-4 Phantom, but a U.S. congressional arms embargo had prohibited them from buying one. Now, the Americans offered to make the Phantom available in exchange for the stolen MiG. A deal was struck, and in January 1968, 17 months after Redfa's MiG had first touched down at Hatzor, 007 was quietly created and flown to the United States. Its destination was a patch of Nevada desert that officially didn't exist. Groom Lake, known to the small number of people cleared to work there as Area 51, was already one of the most consequential addresses in American aviation history. The U-2 spy plane had been developed there. The Mach 3 SR-71 Blackbird had taken its first flights over the same dry lake bed. The facility had been chosen precisely because it was invisible. A remote, restricted expanse of salt flat ringed by mountains, its airspace sealed against civilian and military traffic alike. If you wanted to fly something that nobody was supposed to know about, this was where you flew it. 007 was given a new designation, YF-110, and assigned to a classified program with the name Have Doughnut, a reference to the distinctive ring-shaped air intake that dominated the aircraft's nose. A joint team of Air Force and Navy pilots, drawn from the most experienced test aviators in the U.S. military, was assembled and cleared into the program. The aircraft was kept inside a hangar whenever it wasn't flying, the better to avoid detection by Soviet reconnaissance satellites overhead. When it did take to the air, the airspace above Groom Lake was sealed. Pilots at nearby Nellis Air Force Base, who caught a glimpse of an unfamiliar silhouette on the horizon, were given no explanation. The program's existence was confidential, at a level that made it essentially invisible. The personnel involved couldn't discuss it with their families, their colleagues, or their commanding officers outside the cleared group. The MiG itself, painted over with U.S. Star and Bar insignia, logged in official paperwork under its American designation, was, on paper, just another test aircraft. The fact that it had been built in the Soviet Union, flown operationally by the Iraqi Air Force, and stolen by the Mossad, was not something that appeared in any document that didn't require the highest levels of clearance to read. But this secrecy, however elaborate, was not the point. The point was what happened when the aircraft left the hangar. For the first time in history, American pilots were about to fly a frontline Soviet fighter against their own aircraft in simulated combat, and find out, with brutal precision, exactly what they were up against. The aircraft that rolled out of the hangar at Groom Lake was faster, more agile, and far simpler in design than the American test pilots had expected. The MiG-21 had been designed on the principle that a pilot who was well-trained and unburdened by complex systems could outfight a pilot drowning in instrumentation. It had only a rudimentary radar, no sophisticated navigation equipment, and a cockpit that American test pilots described as Spartan to the point of austerity. What it had instead was a small, sleek silhouette that made it genuinely difficult to acquire visually, or on radar, until it was already close. The Joint Air Force and Navy Evaluation Team flew the aircraft against everything they had. The findings filled classified reports that would not see daylight for decades. The MiG-21's weaknesses, once found, were exploitable. Below 15,000 feet, the aircraft could not go supersonic. Severe airframe buffeting set in above 595 knots, imposing a hard ceiling on its low-altitude performance that American pilots could use to their advantage. Its engine was a particular liability. Spool up from idle to full military power took 14 seconds, a characteristic that American jet engines had solved in the 1950s. In a combat environment where a second could be the difference between a successful engagement and a catastrophic one, 14 seconds was an eternity. The afterburner, when engaged or disengaged, produced a visible puff of white smoke, a calling card that announced the aircraft's presence and intentions to anyone watching. In the cockpit, forward visibility through the gun sight was restricted by a combination of bulletproof glass and the windscreen framing, a significant handicap for a pilot trying to track a target in a turning fight. Rearward visibility was worse. The narrow canopy and fuselage design left a blind cone directly behind and below the tail. The Have Doughnut evaluation team noted that a pursuing American pilot who knew it was there could exploit it with a carefully judged approach. But there was one characteristic that no amount of technical analysis could entirely neutralize. In a turning fight, the kind of engagement American doctrine had spent a decade trying to move away from, and which Vietnam was now forcing back onto the table, the MiG-21's Delta Wing gave it an instantaneous turn rate superior to every major U.S. fighter it faced. The lesson the evaluation team drew from this was unambiguous. Do not turn with a MiG-21. Keep speed up, fight in the vertical, attack from the rear hemisphere, and exit before the engagement becomes a horizontal turning contest. The pilot who followed those rules had a significant advantage. One who didn't was in serious trouble. Have Doughnut was answering many of the questions the Pentagon was asking about the MiG-21. Now, the U.S. needed something similar for the other major threat in the North Vietnamese skies. Getting a hold of a MiG-17 would presumably require another elaborate operation, another Mossad contact, another willing defector, another years-long intelligence effort. The question was where to even begin. As it turned out, they didn't need to. In August 1968, two Syrian Air Force pilots on a routine training mission became disoriented over northern Israel and, believing they were over Lebanon, landed at a small Israeli airfield. They had delivered two frontline Soviet fighters to the enemy entirely by accident. By the end of the year, both aircraft were at Area 51, and the U.S. had its MiG-17s without spending a single dollar or running a single agent. The program was given the name Have Drill. As with Have Doughnut, a joint Air Force and Navy team was assembled, cleared, and given access to the aircraft. Once again, the pilots who arrived were experienced, confident, and certain they understood what they were dealing with. The MiG-17 was, after all, a 1950s design. Subsonic, primitive by late 60s standards, carrying no missiles and only enough cannon ammunition for approximately 6 seconds of continuous fire. Whatever it was doing over North Vietnam, surely it held no surprises for some of the most seasoned test pilots in the U.S. military. But just like the MiG-21, there turned out to be much more to it than first met the eye. The Navy's official summary of the Have Drill evaluation reported that every single one of the pilots engaged in the project lost his first engagement with the MiG-17. The aircraft's performance in air combat maneuvering had taken aback all crews concerned with the project. The age of the aircraft, the report noted, had led to a general overconfidence by U.S. crews prior to their first engagement. The Air Force assessment was blunter still. The MiG-17's capabilities should have shocked no one. The data had been available. The problem was not intelligence. It was overconfidence, complacency, and poor training. A difficult conclusion to sit with. Damning though the data was, it needed to reach the pilots flying combat missions over North Vietnam, urgently. But there was a problem. It couldn't leave the room. The near-impenetrable classification walls around both programs meant the findings couldn't simply be written up in a training manual or discussed at a squadron briefing. The Navy decided that the solution was institutional. If the information couldn't travel through normal channels, they would build a new channel. In early 1969, a small group of 8 F-4 instructors and 1 intelligence officer, handpicked by Lieutenant Commander Dan Peterson, sat down in a requisitioned trailer at Naval Air Station Miramar in California and began building a curriculum from scratch. They had no dedicated aircraft, no formal budget to speak of, and no precedent to follow. What they had was the data from Have Doughnut and Have Drill, a clear understanding of what American pilots were doing wrong, and a collective determination to fix it. The United States Navy Fighter Weapons School opened on March 3, 1969. It would become known almost immediately by a simpler name, Top Gun. What it taught was built directly on the findings from Groom Lake. The MiG-21's blind cone, its engine spool-up time, and its subsonic ceiling below 15,000 feet. The MiG-17's lethal low-speed turning envelope, and the precise techniques for defeating it without getting drawn into a horizontal turning contest. Tactics that had been locked inside classified reports were now being taught to the best fighter pilots the Navy could find, who would then return to their squadrons and teach everyone else. Alongside Navy and Marine Corps crews, selected Air Force pilots were quietly invited to fly against the actual MiGs at Groom Lake, an airspace sealed and marked in red on aeronautical charts, a restricted zone that those who knew about it called, with some dark humor, Red Square. Every one of them lost their first engagement. Every one of them came back with a clearer picture of what they were up against. But flying against a MiG once was not the same thing as a systematically developed force-wide training program. One produced better individual pilots. The other had the potential to spread that knowledge through an entire service via a cadre of returning experts. Vietnam was about to show exactly what the difference looked like. In 1972, President Nixon restarted the large-scale bombing of North Vietnam under Operation Linebacker. As the air war in the skies over Hanoi intensified once more, the results were not subtle. The Navy's victory ratio against North Vietnamese fighters, which had stood at roughly 2.5 to 1 before Top Gun, climbed to 12.5 to 1. It was, by any measure, one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of aerial warfare. The Air Force had not been entirely idle. In October 1972, even as Linebacker was underway, it had established its first aggressor squadron at Nellis Air Force Base, a unit of pilots trained to fly and fight like Soviet adversaries, giving American crews the experience of facing an opponent who thought and flew like a MiG pilot without requiring anyone to be cleared into a program that officially didn't exist. It was a meaningful step, but the aggressors were flying T-38 Talons, not MiGs, and they didn't begin deploying to TAC bases until the spring of 1973, by which point U.S. involvement in Vietnam was effectively over. For the air war that had just been fought, it was too little too late. Yet it wouldn't take long for the Air Force to implement something more ambitious. A fighter pilot was most likely to be shot down in his first 10 combat missions, so the Air Force set out to put its pilots through all 10 without ever leaving American soil. The idea came from Colonel Gale Peck, a Vietnam veteran F-4 pilot who had grown dissatisfied with his service's approach to fighter training. He had learned about Have Doughnut and Have Drill through his work at the Department of Defense. What he found convinced him that the Air Force needed not just a squadron of simulated Soviet opponents, but a large-scale exercise that could expose entire wings to the kind of realistic, high-pressure combat environment that Vietnam had shown was the only reliable preparation for the real thing. He won the support he needed, and in November 1975, the first Red Flag exercise was held at Nellis Air Force Base. Red Flag was built around a single insight that the Nevada desert evaluations had helped crystallize, that a pilot who survives his first 10 combat missions is dramatically more likely to survive the rest, and that those 10 missions could be simulated before they had to happen for real over hostile territory. Where Top Gun worked by producing experts who cascaded knowledge downward through their squadrons, Red Flag aimed to harden entire units directly. The vindication came during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. The Iraqi Air Force was, by most assessments, a poorly trained force. But crucially, it was equipped largely with the same Soviet fighters that American pilots had spent 2 decades studying, simulating, and training against, including the MiG-21, the very aircraft which had started it all. US-led coalition forces established air superiority within a week. 36 Iraqi aircraft were shot down in aerial combat. The rest either fled to Iran or never left the ground. For American pilots, schooled in red flag exercises and aggressor training, the enemy's aircraft held no surprises. The lessons of the Nevada desert had seen to that. The unit that had formed in the wake of Have Doughnut and Have Drill, the 4477th Test and Evaluation Squadron, better known as the Red Eagles, had continued flying Soviet MiGs at Tonopah Test Range for 2 decades after the program had concluded, accumulating over 15,000 sorties against American pilots in aircraft ranging from the MiG-17 to the MiG-23. The squadron's existence was declassified only in 2006. The MiG-21 that Munir Redfa flew to Israel in 1966, the aircraft that would make Have Doughnut possible, today sits at the Israeli Air Force Museum in Hatzerim Air Base, its Israeli markings and 007 serial number restored. To look at it, you might never know the full picture of what it had been through. The classified hangar at Groom Lake, the mock dogfights over the Nevada desert, the reports that would rewrite American military aviation doctrine. But the evidence is written into every red flag exercise that runs at Nellis, every aggressor pilot who thinks and flies like a Soviet adversary, every fighter in the U.S. inventory that carries an internal gun. American air power, the most formidable in the world, had been forced to go to school. It never forgot the lesson.